Day 3, the test. So what I like to do often when I'm writing, and I would always tell my students this too sometimes, is when I come up with an idea and I'm burning to tell it, I can't wait to get to the starting gate, so to speak. Sometimes I'll actually sit down and write like the first scene or the first 10 pages even. But that's it. You got to stop after that, because otherwise you go out into left field and you're totally lost and you'll never get back. I also tell stories about that. It's kind of like rambling stories where you're excited to write, but somewhere you run out of steam and you're like, uh-oh, and you got to start from scratch. But on the other hand, if you have a really cool idea and you're excited to start writing it, there's no reason not to write the first scene, first few scenes. You can always just toss them and start over, but it's fun to like sit down and get a feel for the character, for the story, all that, and that's the opening scene. So in Sparkle, this story about sparkling wine with my lead character Mass, whose name will change, but it's based on this guy Mass that I know. This eccentric, well, he's not that eccentric, he's a unique winemaker, very unique. But he's got a big beard, glasses, he's perfect for the part. I wish he was an actor. But that's a thought. Anyway, the bottom line is that with Sparkle, when I first outlined it, because I like to outline how I put a story together, and I realized that I definitely had a story, and I was definitely burning to tell it. I also I decided I wanted to write the first few scenes, and that was mainly actually also for Mass's sake, because he's not a screenwriter by any means, or even a writer as far as I know, but I wanted to show him how it's done. And so, because I needed him on board, because I was going to be interviewing him. I mean, he was totally happy to, hear my eccentric take on things too, because I'm eccentric myself a little bit, I guess. But he was happy to hear me come up with ideas a little bit, but I wanted to make sure that he knew I was legit and that it worked. So I wanted him to be a little bit of, a part of the process, which is very unusual. Again, I've always been very secretive about my screenwriting over the years, and wouldn't show anybody, even my wife or friends or anybody, scripts until they were completely done, and that I was pretty happy with. But now, for this particular script, I decided to go almost exactly the opposite, where I'm not collaborating. Well, in a little way, I guess I am, but it's more just seeking advice. Let's just say that as I pound out the journey on the keyboard on the screenplay about this movie Sparkle. So I decided anyway, because Mass had never written a screenplay, written or read a screenplay for that matter. Of course, he's seen movies. I decided to write the first few scenes to show him, what it looks like on paper. So I came up with I think I originally came up with one beginning, and then I had a second beginning. So the original beginning opens with Mass being like 14 years old, like a teenager. And this is also based on truth, or based on reality, because this is what happened. It's sort of a mix of things that happened to me when I was that age. Basically, I put him in America, and he's outside of a liquor store, a package store, as they call it. We used to call them packies, package store. These places that just sell, beer, wine, soda, stuff like that, and liquor, hard liquor. And where I grew up, when I was in boarding school in Western Massachusetts, there was a place called Lynn's Package Store, and I believe I even actually call it Lynn's Package Store in the script, for lack of a better name. You can always change things later on. That's also okay. You can use real people's names, just change them later, if it makes you more comfortable when you're writing and getting into character and such. But I used to hang out literally when I was 15 years old, because in America you have to be 21 to buy booze. So me and my friends would go to the parking lot of this Lynn's Package Store near the school where we were going to school on a Friday afternoon and get some poor person to buy us booze. And we got really good at figuring out who would do it. Obviously, older people were not good. You had to get someone young, someone cool looking, and usually they say sure. You give them your $25 and they come out and they bring you some cheap beer, cheap wine, cheap whatever we wanted. And so that's how I decided to open the story. Mass is now a teenager. He is still from Denmark. He is visiting, he's an exchange student in Massachusetts, where I grew up. And he's at this Lynn's package store in a parking lot with 2 teenagers from his school where he is an exchange student. And they are doing exactly what I did, trying to get people to buy them booze. The only thing is, the difference is that Mass is a wine expert, right? So he actually, even at 15 years old, he knows his wine, and he wants some kind of Pinot Noir that's in the advertisement, the paper flyer that's out in front of the package store. Whereas his friends, they just want some cheap Boone's Farm wine. And the whole point of this, by the way, is to introduce sparkling apple wine or sparkling fruit wine. And in America, when I grew up, one of my first experiences with alcohol was this thing called Boone's Farm wine. Check it out. It's on YouTube. If you go there, it's hilarious. I showed Mass this video because there's a commercial for Boone's Farm Strawberry Fields or Strawberry Explosion fruit wine or whatever they call it. It's hilarious. So it's from the 70s, and it's like an old granny, like 85-year-old granny on a chopper on a motorcycle, and she comes up and she's drinking this, she comes up to this couple who's drinking this Boone's Farm wine under a tree or something, and she does a wheelie and flies by them or something. But it's hilarious. But it was Boone's Farm, and I used to go out to this island in the bay, kind of like out here, with my friend on a canoe, and we would drink this wine because on the island the police couldn't get us. When I was a teenager, it's like the only thing the police had. It seems like the only thing they did in my hometown, because there's nothing else to do, was look for teenagers drinking, basically. So we figured the island was a pretty safe place to be. So both of those actually come into this scene. So there's Mass. He's 14 years old. He's hanging out with his 2 American friends, and they're asking some guy to buy them booze, and they're making fun of Mass because he asked for a $20 bottle of Pinot Noir, and they're getting these $2 bottles of Boone's Farm. And lo and behold, they get the wine, and then they go out to this island that I just spoke about on a canoe, so the police won't get them. And of course, his friends, these Americans, have a funnel, so they're actually drinking this awful fruit wine with a funnel, and probably get sick, if I recall correctly how I wrote it. But for him, it's he is the epitome of the wine snob in that scene. He's like, oh my God, he wants his Pinot Noir to sip, and these guys are chugging sparkling apple wine. But the idea was that it was the introduction of why we think apple wine is cheap. And I think I actually got it across pretty good. Like, okay, so teenagers like to drink this crap, or winos or whatever, but it's not really a legitimate kind of normal wine, or even champagne for that matter. Which is also funny because I still have this kind of weird, not separation, but it's hard to differentiate for me. Sparkling apple wine, sparkling wine, i.e., Prosecco or Champagne, the various regions of Europe here where they name their sparkling or bubbly wines, and normal wine. So somehow I think normal wine. I think of like white wine like Chardonnay and red wine like Cabernet as a totally different category than Champagne, even though they are in the same section at your local supermarket. But of course, Mass is right that for wine connoisseurs, they're just 2 different things. But the apple wine or the fruit wines, that's like in aisle 17 next to the cereal or something. So, but for me, it's just hard when I'm talking about vineyards. I still can't. I somehow don't think of Champagne as a vineyard. I don't know why. So I have to get over that. That's just a brain thing. Anyway, I digress. But and I think it works in the screenplay how I finally figured out how to explain that to the in layman's terms to us average Joes, which is also important. You always have to take the average Joe or Josephina into consideration when you're explaining anything technical or that's unique, something that they don't know about, that they aren't educated in. You don't want to be over the top, but you still got to explain it to them. Anyway, so this opening scene, is him basically buying this nice bottle of Pinot Noir. His friends get this cheap $1.50 a bottle sparkling wine. They go out to this island and they drink it, and of course the cops come. And that's the end of the scene. The cops bust them anyway, and that's also semi-true. And then I remember thinking, like, I finished it, and it was probably 3 or 4 pages long. It was funny, and I know what it was. I talked to Mass again. I was interviewing him at the time. It's really important, by the way, if you are going to actually write a story based on truth or based on somebody, to interview them as much as possible, especially if they're good at storytelling, which Mass is excellent at. So he has all sorts of stories. He's never written them down, but he has them in his brain. And so I got lots of them. But one of them was this thing called gushing. Again, talk about education. I had no idea, never heard of it. I'm sure probably you haven't either if you're watching this. But gushing, again, I'm no expert, but basically it's this thing, this phenomenon that can happen with sparkling wine bottles like champagne, fruit wine, whatever, anything that's sparkling or bubbly. Don't think it happens with still wine, but anyway, I'm not the expert. But the bottom line is sometimes if it's not refrigerated or handled properly, the insides, the contents of the bottle will explode out of the bottle. Even sometimes, spontaneously without anybody messing with the cork or anything like that. But certainly sometimes when you're opening the cork, the thing will shoot out too. We've all done that with a champagne bottle, but the whole interior, kind of like if you shake a soda, I guess, and then you open it, like half of it comes out. But even worse, it's like it shoots across the room or hits the ceiling, and it's literally a bad thing when it's kind of maybe it hasn't gone bad. It doesn't smell bad or anything, but it is like literally an explosion. So the bottle doesn't break, but the interior completely empties everywhere. So with a red sparkling wine, like made from fruit like cherries or something, imagine the disaster, the mess that would make. And so Mass had this dream. That's what it was. He'd actually been at a huge competition in Germany, which he won. But he had this dream because in Germany, when you win a fruit wine competition anyway, they often they ask you to send a couple of cases of wine down in advance. So they actually tell you in advance that you've won, even though it's supposed to be a surprise. But then they want the wine on hand to give to the well-to-do guests who are in the audience. So the way I envision it is there's a bunch of tables, the way he told me actually, there's a bunch of circular tables in this big convention hall or whatever, and they're all covered with white tablecloths and people, almost like a black tie event. People, dressed very nicely and done up to the nines, and then he goes up in his tux or whatever and says, "I'm the winner, yay!" And everybody pulls out the Mass's wine and they take a sip. In his dream, because he was in this, they put him up in this really fancy hotel room down in Frankfurt or wherever it was in Germany, and it was I envisioned it like a Liberace or an Elvis room in Vegas. It's a big room, all white sofas, white carpets, white everything, white bathrobes, everything, and that's how he described it. And then I think there's something in reality that happened where there was a bottle gushed. But his dream was that it actually happened down in the convention. So it blows up in the room and ruins the sofa. And then he realizes, because the thing is with gushing, apparently if it happens en masse. So if it's not just one bottle, it's the whole group. When the bottle was produced, something went wrong or there was refrigerated incorrectly. So they actually tend to explode almost at the same time. Like he literally came back that's what he's telling me. He came back one weekend after being away from the winery. It's closed, and he came in and there was literally looked like dents in the huge refrigerator, like bullet holes almost. I mean, it hadn't punctured, but there was big dents in all of it. And he couldn't figure out what it was, and he looked over, all these bottles on this wine rack had gushed, had exploded, and the corks had blown into this refrigerator and made dents in it. I mean, that's how violent and how forceful these things are. But anyway, so the reality is that, or the dream was that this happens actually at the table side, just as he's walking up to the podium with the maitre d' or the MC to be announced as the big winner of the best wine at the competition. Everybody has their bottles put on the table and they all explode simultaneously, so all the guests are covered with red wine. So I decided, okay, I'm going to change my beginning of my little script for Mass here, and I'm going to keep that one scene with a teenager, but I'm going to make that the second scene. I'm going to make the very first scene this dream sequence. Just to introduce people to gushing and the disaster and sparkling wine in a legitimate sense, and then show them about how people frown on it as cheap, a cheap cousin of wine, which I do in that scene with the teenagers. But the first one, it's very upscale, and you're kind of surprised because you don't even know what it is. Actually, it's just some kind of wine. But anyway, I recreate that dream sequence. and I think the funniest part actually on my part is that I have this maitre d' who speaks only German, and Mass doesn't understand him really, but it's a dream. So fortunately, because it's a dream, the German is maitre d' or MC or whatever, he's subtitled. So when Mass talks to him in his dream, he reads the subtitles. So I just thought, oh, that could be funny because it's a dream sequence, but you can do anything in a dream. So you can subtitle a German guy. And Mass thought that was funny too. So actually I wrote that whole scene, and so that's like 3 pages long, 2 or 3 pages, with this whole gushing thing where it explodes all over the guests. So it introduces us to that whole concept. And then it's followed up with the teenager scene. And I showed that to Matt. So that was like 9 pages, maybe 10 pages actually total, the beginning of Sparkle. And guess what? They're not in the script. As cool as they were, who knows, maybe I'll somehow try to figure out, or there'll be a part 2, a sequel, Killing Your Darlings. But when I sat down and, rethought the script, that was actually before I even considered the second big element of the actual overall story, which is that he is that he can create wine from apples that taste like grapes. But this is back when it was just only about it being that his wine was sold at this, the planet's best restaurant in the world at the time, Geranium, that his first bottle of wine was sold at. That was the original story. And that relates directly to this gushing thing. But anyway, that's not why I got rid of it. It's just because I came up with a better beginning, which I'll talk about next time, which is in there now and probably will stay. But beginnings are important because that's what grabs your audience, particularly before the movie's made, and that audience being the people who actually might support funding for your screenplay or interest in your screenplay. So you need to grab your reader, as soon as possible, and that's the introduction, right? So how do you do that? In Sparkle, do you start with, Mass as a teenager getting busted by the cops, Mass in a dream sequence, blowing up red wine over expensive people's gowns and tuxedos? Maybe. It's certainly entertaining, but I chose a different direction, which I'll talk about next time.